Hey guys, tonight we're diving into the most powerful, most misunderstood and most thoroughly illegal substance ever accidentally discovered by a Swiss chemist on a bicycle. We're talking about acid. LSD, lysergic acid diethylamide. The thing your uncle mentioned once at Thanksgiving and then went very quiet for a very long time. Not the tie-dye poster version, not the Beatles in matching outfits version, the real story. A story about a molecule so small you couldn't see it with a microscope, yet somehow powerful enough to make a grown man believe he was melting into his kitchen floor while having a genuine philosophical breakthrough about the nature of time. So before you get comfortable, and you're going to want to get very comfortable tonight, take a second to like this video and subscribe, but only if you actually enjoy what I do here, and a genuine warm thank you to the viewer who suggested this one. You know who you are. You dropped the idea in the comments like it was nothing, and honestly it was everything. Your suggestions are what keep this channel alive and strange. Leave a comment letting me know where you're tuning in from and what time it is. It's somehow always 2 a.m. somewhere, and I respect that deeply. Now, if you're also listening on Spotify, which you can, because this channel is on Spotify now, the link is in the description, and you're welcome. Dim those lights. Turn on a fan, pull up whatever weighted blanket or suspicious cat is nearest to you, and let's ease into this together. Before we go any further, have you ever wondered what it actually feels like to take LSD? Is it as terrifying as your high school health teacher implied, or is it genuinely as revelatory as half the musicians from the 1960s insist? Did Albert Hofmann, the man who accidentally invented it, really ride his bicycle home while the world dissolved around him, or is that just a very good story? Did the United States government truly dose unwilling citizens with acid in secret laboratory experiments and then spend 40 years pretending they hadn't? Did Tim Leary actually believe he could change the world one sugar cube at a time, or was he just the most confident man at a very unusual party? And more to the point, how did one tiny, colourless, odourless molecule manage to terrify entire governments, inspire entire musical genres, reshape neuroscience, and end up being the subject of the most expensive covert research program in American history, all while technically fitting on the tip of a pin? Congratulations, you've just woken up in 1943 in a pharmaceutical research laboratory in Basel, Switzerland. There's a faint chemical smell in the air. A quiet man in a lab coat is about to make history by accident, and somewhere outside the Second World War is consuming the planet. Pay attention, things are about to get very strange. Let's begin at the very beginning, which in this case means a laboratory, a fungus, and a man so methodical that his greatest act of chaos happened entirely by mistake. Albert Hofmann was born in 1906 in Baden, Switzerland, the eldest of 4 children. He was, by all accounts, exactly the kind of person you'd expect to spend his life in a laboratory. Curious, precise, deeply interested in the natural world, and possessed of a philosophical streak that most professional chemists spend their careers trying to suppress. He studied chemistry at the University of Zurich, graduated with distinction, and joined the pharmaceutical company Sandoz in Basel in 1929. His work there was the kind of meticulous, years-long organic chemistry that most people would find either fascinating or deeply sleep-inducing, depending on their disposition. Hofmann was assigned to a research program examining the constituents of ergot, a fungus that grows on rye and other cereal grains, turning them into dark, warped little kernels that look faintly sinister and turn out to be exactly as sinister as they look. Ergot had a long and genuinely horrifying history in Europe. Outbreaks of ergotism, known as St. Anthony's Fire, had periodically swept through communities that unknowingly ate contaminated bread, producing convulsions, burning sensations in the limbs, gangrenous blackening of the extremities, and what the historical record describes, with admirable understatement, as mental disturbances. Medieval chroniclers documented whole villages descending into collective madness. Limbs fell off. People danced uncontrollably in the streets. Several historians have proposed that ergot contamination was responsible for some of the stranger episodes in the historical record of pre-industrial Europe, including possibly the Salem witch trials of 1692, where rye was a dietary staple and the summer had been unusually wet, ideal conditions for ergot growth. So the raw material was not exactly inviting. But Hofmann was interested in it for a specific reason. Ergot contained a class of compounds called alkaloids, some of which had known pharmacological activity. The drug ergotamine had already been isolated and was in clinical use as a vasoconstrictor. Sandoz wanted to know whether other ergot derivatives might have therapeutic applications, particularly in obstetrics, where compounds that could influence uterine contractions were of significant clinical interest. Hofmann's job was to synthesize a systematic series of compounds derived from lysergic acid, the chemical backbone of all ergot alkaloids, and test each one for activity. He approached this work with the patience it required. Organic synthesis at this level means building molecules atom by atom, reacting precursors in carefully controlled conditions, isolating products through laborious purification processes, and then submitting each compound to pharmacological testing. It is not glamorous work. Most of the compounds produce nothing interesting. The 23rd lysergic acid derivative, LSD-23, showed some activity but nothing compelling. The 24th was similarly underwhelming. Hofmann synthesized LSD-25-DOS-D, lysergic acid diethylamide, 25th compound in his series of Sandoz in 1938. Initial animal testing conducted by Sandoz's pharmacology department showed that it produced some stimulation in the animals, restlessness, a sort of agitation, but nothing that the pharmacologists found worth pursuing. The compound was filed away. Hofmann moved on to other work. Here is the part that makes this story strange in a particular way. Hofmann was bothered by it. Not in an obsessive way, not in a way that showed up in any official record, just a quiet, persistent sense that he had not finished with LSD-25. He later described it as a premonition, a feeling without scientific basis that the compound deserved a second look. 5 years passed. The Second World War began and consumed Europe. Hofmann continued his ergot research, making contributions to the isolation of other alkaloids that would eventually find clinical application. And then, in 1943, for reasons he could not fully articulate even to himself, he returned to LSD-25. He resynthesized it. He was working with care as always. But at some point during the synthesis, a tiny quantity of the compound, unmeasurable, invisible, absorbed perhaps through the skin of his fingertips, entered his system. Within 40 minutes, he began to feel strange. He left the laboratory early, rode his bicycle home, and arrived at his front door a fundamentally different man than the one who'd left that morning. He just didn't know it yet. The 25th compound had been waiting, it turned out, for exactly this. Let's talk about April 19th, 1943, a day that pharmaceutical history now commemorates with a completely earnest name, Bicycle Day. Hofmann had first synthesized lysergic acid diethylamide 5 years earlier, in 1938, as part of his systematic effort to create new compounds from ergot alkaloids. The compound had shown no particular promise in initial animal tests, and Sandoz had shelved it. Hofmann moved on. But something about LSD-25 continued to nag at him, a vague, unscientific intuition that he had missed something, and in April of 43 he synthesized it again for further study. During that second synthesis, he absorbed a tiny amount through his fingertips, which at the time seemed like a minor inconvenience. He noticed the effects at his workbench around 2:30 in the afternoon. A peculiar dizziness, a restlessness that seemed to come from somewhere he couldn't locate, an intensification of light that shouldn't have been intensifying. The laboratory windows were the same windows they had always been. He wrote a brief note in his laboratory journal, informed his supervisor that he was not feeling well, and set off home. He did not take a car or a tram. He rode his bicycle, accompanied by his laboratory assistant, through the familiar streets of Basel. By the time he arrived home, the world had become unrecognizable. Colours were saturated beyond anything he had seen before. Forms shifted and breathed. The face of his neighbour, who came to check on him at his assistant's request, appeared to him as a malevolent mask. Every feature distorted into something grotesque. He was convinced, with the complete certainty that the experience generated, that he had lost his mind permanently, that the competent, orderly existence he had built for himself, the laboratory, the careful work, the wife and children, the satisfying arc of a professional life, had all been revoked in a single afternoon. He asked his assistant to call the family doctor. The doctor arrived. He examined Hofmann thoroughly, pulse, blood pressure, pupils, reflexes, and found, to the bafflement of everyone present, that all vital signs were entirely normal. There was nothing medically wrong with the man sitting in his chair believing he was dying. The doctor stayed. And Hofmann, over the next several hours, moved through the experience rather than out of it. The terror did not vanish immediately, but gradually it shifted. The distortions became less threatening and more extraordinary. Colours took on what he later described as a quality of inner luminescence. He felt, at moments, a dissolution of the boundary between himself and the world around him that was terrifying and also, somehow, profoundly beautiful. By the time the effect subsided, somewhere around 8 in the evening, 5 or 6 hours after the peak, Hofmann felt physically completely fine. Better than fine, actually. He was hungry. He drank some milk. He slept. The following morning he woke with a clarity of mind that sometimes follows an intense experience and, with characteristic Swiss thoroughness, sat down to write a detailed account of everything that had happened. He was a scientist. He understood immediately that what he'd experienced was a pharmacological effect of the compound he'd been working with. He also understood with equal clarity that the compound was active at an extraordinarily low dose, far lower than anything previously documented. He conducted a self-experiment 3 days later, on April 19th, deliberately ingesting what he calculated to be a conservative dose, 250 micrograms. It was, as subsequent research would establish, approximately 2.5 times a typical effective dose. The experience that followed was overwhelming. A complete dissolution of ordinary reality lasting the better part of a day, requiring his assistant to accompany him by bicycle because driving was impossible. The bicycle ride home that afternoon, a man pedalling through a Swiss city while reality quietly fell apart around him, became one of the iconic images of 20th century science. Not because it was dramatic exactly, but because of the almost absurd contrast it embodied. A careful, responsible, middle-aged chemist in a perfectly ordinary city, doing a perfectly ordinary thing, while undergoing what may have been one of the most extreme perceptual experiences a human being can have without dying. He wrote it all down. He submitted his report to Sandoz, and the world, which had no idea what was coming, went on with its afternoon. Let's take a moment to talk about what lysergic acid diethylamide actually is, because the gap between how it's discussed in pop culture and what it actually does at the molecular level is genuinely staggering. LSD is a semi-synthetic compound, meaning it's derived from a naturally occurring substance, in this case lysergic acid from ergot. but requires laboratory synthesis to reach its final form. It is extraordinary in its potency. A standard dose is measured in micrograms, millionths of a gram. A single gram of pure LSD could theoretically dose somewhere between 10,000 and 20,000 people, depending on sensitivity. To give you a sense of scale, a single aspirin tablet contains 500 milligrams. A typical LSD dose contains around 100 micrograms. That is 5,000 times smaller than one aspirin. And yet those 100 micrograms are enough to produce 8 to 12 hours of profoundly altered perception, altered thinking, altered emotional processing, and in some cases, altered everything. The molecule itself is not particularly large. Organic chemists looking at its structure would recognize it as a tetracyclic compound, 4 rings fused together in a specific arrangement, with a diethylamide group attached. What makes it extraordinary is not its size or its complexity, but its shape, and the way that shape allows it to fit with remarkable precision into certain protein structures in the human brain, specifically serotonin receptors. The brain is full of receptors designed to receive serotonin, a neurotransmitter involved in mood regulation, perception, appetite, and a dozen other functions. And LSD's molecular geometry allows it to bind to a subset of these receptors with a tenacity that is, in pharmacological terms, almost unprecedented. Specifically, it binds to the 5-HT2A receptor, which is found in particularly high concentrations in the cortex, the outermost layer of the brain, most involved in conscious perception, thought, and sense of self. When LSD binds to 5-HT2A receptors, it activates them, triggering cascades of intracellular signaling. But here is the detail that distinguishes LSD from most drugs. It doesn't just bind to the receptor and then wash off in the normal time frame. It locks in. Recent cryo-electron microscopy imaging has revealed that once LSD binds to the 5-HT2A receptor, a lid-like protein structure closes over the top of the molecule, essentially trapping it in place. The receptor cannot reset. The signal keeps firing. This molecular stubbornness is, in large part, why an LSD experience lasts 8 to 12 hours, while other compounds with similar receptor targets produce effects of 2 or 3 hours. The effects of this sustained receptor activation are complex and still not fully mapped. What researchers can say is that LSD dramatically disrupts the normal hierarchical organization of brain activity. Under ordinary circumstances, the brain operates in a fairly organized way. High-level regions exert top-down control over lower-level ones, filtering and shaping incoming sensory information before it reaches conscious awareness. LSD partially disrupts these control mechanisms, allowing information to flow between regions that would not normally communicate directly. The result is a kind of cross-wiring of perception. Sensory systems bleed into one another in the phenomenon known as synesthesia, where music might produce visible colours or touch might produce sounds. Thoughts and emotions become attached to sensory experiences in unusual combinations. The sense of time distorts. The sense of self, normally so automatic and continuous that we forget it is a construction, begins to feel optional. The drug is not toxic in any conventional sense. It does not damage organs. It is not physically addictive. The lethal dose in humans is not known because no confirmed human death from LSD toxicity alone has ever been documented. The doses required to produce lethality in animal studies would require a human to consume quantities so enormous that the physical act of consuming them would be the obstacle. This pharmacological safety profile is, given the cultural narrative around the drug, one of its most counterintuitive features. The danger of LSD is not what it does to your body. It is what it does to the mind, in the wrong context, in the wrong state, in the wrong hands, which, as history would demonstrate rather extensively, is a different category of danger entirely, but a real one nonetheless. Here is where the story takes a turn that feels, from a modern perspective, almost incomprehensibly optimistic. Sandoz Pharmaceuticals, upon learning what their quiet chemist had accidentally discovered, did not lock the compound away, file a classified report, or quietly dispose of the samples. Instead, they patented it, gave it the trade name Delysid, and in 1947 began distributing it to researchers and psychiatrists around the world with the cheerful suggestion that it might be useful as a tool for psychotherapy. The accompanying literature proposed two main applications. First, as an adjunct to psychoanalysis, allowing patients to access repressed memories and emotions more readily. And second, and this is the part that takes a moment to absorb, as a way for psychiatrists to briefly experience a psychotic state themselves, so they might better understand their patients. Sandoz was, in effect, recommending that mental health professionals take LSD in a clinical setting for professional development purposes. This seems extraordinary from a 21st century vantage point. But consider the context. In 1947, psychiatry was in a peculiar position. It was a medical specialty with substantial prestige and almost no effective treatments. Psychoanalysis dominated the field theoretically, but its practical results were slow, expensive, and available only to patients who could afford years of weekly sessions. The physical treatments that did exist, insulin shock therapy, electroconvulsive therapy, lobotomy, were blunt instruments that damaged as often as they helped. The first antipsychotic drug, chlorpromazine, would not be introduced until 1952. The first antidepressant would not arrive until 1958. In this context, a legal pharmaceutical compound that produced dramatic alterations in consciousness could be administered in a single session and appeared to generate meaningful psychological experiences that patients themselves described as significant, looked not like a liability, but like a genuine opportunity. Sandoz distributed Delysid free of charge to any qualified researcher who requested it. The samples arrived in small glass ampules containing 100 micrograms per milliliter, neatly packaged and accompanied by the official Sandoz product information sheet, which described the drug's effects with the measured language of pharmaceutical marketing, and recommended that any physician planning to administer it should first take it themselves. This was standard practice. You would not, the reasoning went, be able to guide a patient through the experience without knowing what the experience was, which is, in retrospect, completely reasonable, and also the premise of a situation that the modern FDA would look at with a kind of horizontal, speechless blink. Researchers across Europe and North America requested samples. Psychiatrists at major academic medical centres took LSD themselves under clinical conditions and wrote up their experiences in medical journals with the sober professionalism their training had instilled. Painters and musicians began to hear about it through research contacts. Writers showed up at university hospitals asking if they could participate in studies. By the early 1950s, a small but growing network of researchers, therapists, artists, and interested observers had encountered LSD through legitimate channels, and the word was spreading that something genuinely unusual was available, if you knew where to look. A pharmaceutical product, legal, professionally sanctioned, and by all accounts, unlike anything that had existed before. The sample vials multiplied. The request to Sandoz increased, the reports in the literature accumulated, and somewhere in Langley, Virginia, in the offices of an organization that had been founded only months before the first Delysid samples were distributed, people with very different ideas about what this compound might be useful for were beginning to pay attention. In the late 1940s and throughout the 1950s, a remarkable thing happened in psychiatric research circles. a substantial number of serious, credentialed, hard-working scientists became genuinely convinced that LSD might be one of the most important therapeutic discoveries of the century. The early clinical reports were striking. Alcoholic patients who had failed every available treatment were experiencing lasting sobriety after single high-dose LSD sessions. Patients with severe anxiety, obsessive disorders, or treatment-resistant depression were reporting profound shifts in perspective that outlasted the drug itself by months and sometimes years. The language in the journals was careful, measured, professional, but underneath it you could detect something that looked a great deal like excitement. The psychiatrist Humphrey Osmond was working in Saskatchewan, Canada, where he had taken a position at the Weyburn Mental Hospital, partly because it was one of the few research environments where he had the freedom to do unconventional work. Osmond had arrived at LSD through mescaline research. He was interested in the structural similarities between mescaline and adrenaline, and had wondered whether naturally occurring psychosis might involve a similar endogenous compound. LSD represented to him a tool for investigating the biochemistry of altered states, but the clinical applications soon took over. Over the course of the 1950s, Osmond and his colleague Abram Hoffer treated over 700 alcoholic patients with high-dose LSD-assisted therapy and reported recovery rates that compared favourably to anything the field had previously achieved. Osmond is also responsible for coining the word psychedelic. He needed a term for the class of substances he was working with, a word that didn't carry the clinical connotations of psychotomimetic, which implied these compounds mimicked psychosis, a framing he considered inaccurate and pejorative. He proposed psychedelic from the Greek words for mind and manifesting in a correspondence with Aldous Huxley, who was himself experimenting with mescaline and writing about it in the book The Doors of Perception. The two men exchanged proposed terms in verse, as one does. The word stuck. In the United Kingdom, Ronald Sanderson was conducting LSD-assisted psychotherapy sessions at Powick Hospital in Worcestershire, working with patients who had not responded to other treatments. His method involved regular sessions over weeks or months, with the therapist present throughout, guiding the patient through whatever emerged under the drug's influence. The results he reported were significant enough to attract attention from the broader psychiatric community. Some of his patients described their LSD sessions as the most important experiences of their lives. Several reported that issues they had been unable to address in years of conventional therapy had resolved or transformed in the course of a few LSD sessions. In Zurich, at the University Hospital where Hofmann still worked nearby at Sandoz, researchers were examining LSD's effects on normal subjects and on people with diagnosed psychiatric conditions. In Prague, a young Czech psychiatrist named Stanislav Grof was beginning what would become a decades-long project of documenting LSD's therapeutic effects in extraordinary detail. The scientific journals of the period contain hundreds of papers examining LSD's potential with the measured enthusiasm of researchers who believe they are watching something important unfold. These were not fringe figures operating outside the mainstream. They were published, peer-reviewed, institutionally affiliated scientists who had obtained their Sandoz samples through legitimate channels and were doing what researchers do, asking careful questions and writing down what they found. The consensus by the late 1950s was not that LSD was a proven treatment for anything. It was that LSD was a compound of extraordinary and not yet fully understood potential, that the early results were genuinely promising across a range of conditions, and that further research was not just warranted but urgently necessary. Nobody in that world writing those papers, attending those conferences, could have predicted how completely and how quickly that research program would be shut down. But the shutdown was already being prepared, in a different kind of laboratory, by people with a different kind of question entirely. And here is where things take a darker turn. While psychiatrists were cautiously optimistic about LSD's therapeutic applications, several government agencies were asking a very different set of questions. The United States military and intelligence community, in the paranoid early years of the Cold War, became intensely interested in the possibility that LSD might function as a truth serum, a brainwashing agent, a chemical weapon, or some combination of all three. The Soviets, it was feared, had obtained large quantities of the drug. The possibility that enemy agents might dose American soldiers, diplomats, or politicians was taken seriously at the highest levels. The answer, apparently, was to dose Americans first. The CIA's interest in LSD predated MKultra. In 1950, the agency launched a program called Artichoke, focused on whether it was possible to control human behavior through chemical, biological, or psychological means. LSD was identified as a candidate early on, and covert testing, meaning testing on people who didn't know they were receiving a drug, began almost immediately. The reasoning, as reconstructed from the documents that survived later investigations, was straightforward in its brutality. If you needed to know whether LSD would incapacitate an enemy agent, you needed to know how people behaved when unexpectedly dosed. You couldn't get that information by dosing willing volunteers, so you dosed people who weren't willing, or people who didn't know they were volunteers. MKultra, which officially succeeded Artichoke in 1953, was larger, more systematic, and more comprehensively criminal. Under the direction of Sidney Gottlieb, a PhD chemist who, by all accounts, was a genuinely complex figure, described by some who knew him as thoughtful and even kind, and by the historical record as the architect of programs that caused enormous suffering. MKultra encompassed over 150 sub-projects at universities, hospitals, prisons, and commercial establishments across the United States and Canada. LSD was one of many substances examined. Others included barbiturates, amphetamines, mescaline, scopolamine, and various combinations. Hypnosis, sensory deprivation, electroconvulsive therapy, and psychological manipulation were applied alongside the drugs. The subjects were, in a significant proportion of cases, people with no ability to consent or resist. Prisoners were told they were receiving medical treatment. Mental patients were dosed as part of official-looking research protocols. Sex workers employed by the CIA in San Francisco were given LSD by an operative while hidden cameras recorded the results. Military personnel were told they were participating in chemical defense research without being told what chemicals were involved. A CIA document recovered during the Church Committee investigations of the 1970s described the dosing of unsuspecting members of the public as the most efficient means of gathering the data required. The legal framework that would have made these activities criminal did not yet fully exist. The Nuremberg Code, which established informed consent as a principle of medical research, had been articulated in 1947 in response to Nazi medical experiments, but it had no enforcement mechanism in the United States. The domestic protections that would have prohibited these programs were not enacted until well after the programs were in operation. What was being done was not, in any meaningful sense, regulated, and the classification of MKultra's activities meant that almost no one outside the programs knew they existed. The CIA would later destroy most of the relevant documents in 1973, when it became clear that investigations were coming. What survived, the documents that were accidentally missed or preserved in administrative files, is enough to establish the broad outline. The full extent of what was done is still unknown. There is one name from the MKultra years that history has not been allowed to forget, partly because the story attached to it is so disturbing that it refuses to be quietly filed away. Frank Olson. Olson was a biochemist and biological weapons researcher working for the United States Army at Fort Detrick in Maryland, a facility that was, in the early 1950s, the center of America's classified biological and chemical weapons research program. He was, by accounts from colleagues and family, an intelligent, curious, somewhat anxious man who believed in what he was doing and was good at it. He had a wife and 3 young children. He was 37 years old. In November of 1953, Olson attended a CIA-organized retreat at a lodge called Deep Creek Lake in western Maryland, along with colleagues from the Special Operations Division and several CIA officers. The stated purpose was a scientific review meeting. At some point during the retreat, the attendees were served drinks that had been secretly spiked with LSD by Sidney Gottlieb. Olson was not informed he had received a drug until approximately 20 minutes after consuming it. This was, according to the CIA's own internal logic, an experiment in how subjects responded to unexpected dosing, which tells you something about how the participants in MKultra thought about the people they were working with. Olson's LSD experience was bad, deeply bad. The days that followed the retreat were, by every account, a period of severe psychological disturbance. Colleagues reported that he seemed anxious, withdrawn, and fundamentally changed. He told his wife that he had made a terrible mistake, without specifying what it was. He was unable to focus on work. A CIA-approved psychiatrist named Harold Abramson, who was himself a MKultra contractor, a detail that is either ironic or sinister depending on your perspective, evaluated Olson and determined that he needed further treatment. A trip to New York was arranged. On the night of November 28, 1953, Frank Olson went through the window of room 1018 at the Hotel Statler in Midtown Manhattan. He died on the pavement below. He was alone in the room at the time, or appeared to be. The CIA classified everything connected to the incident within hours. His wife was told it was a suicide. His children were told it was a suicide. For 22 years, that was the official story. In 1975, when the Church Committee investigations forced the declassification of some MKultra documents, Olson's family learned for the first time that he had been secretly drugged. President Ford invited them to the White House and apologized. CIA Director William Colby met with them. The family received a financial settlement from Congress. The official position remained suicide. In 1994, Olson's son Eric had the body exhumed. A forensic examination conducted by pathologist James Stars found a hematoma on the left side of Olson's skull inconsistent with a fall from a window, consistent with a blow to the head administered before the fall. The New York District Attorney opened a homicide investigation. It was eventually closed without charges. The case has never been prosecuted. Frank Olson's death remains, in the official record, an unsolved matter. His name has become, in the decades since, a kind of shorthand for what happens when institutions with absolute power and no accountability decide that some people's lives are expendable in the service of information. Now let's skip ahead a decade and across the country to California, because the story of LSD is not only a story of government programs and laboratory trials. It is also, inescapably, the story of what happens when a substance of this nature escapes from the laboratory and meets the 1960s counterculture at precisely the wrong moment, or possibly the right one, depending on where you stand. Ken Kesey was a writer, a large, athletic, charismatic Oregonian who had arrived at Stanford on a creative writing fellowship in 1958 and was shortly thereafter offered money by a government-connected research program to take experimental drugs and report on their effects. He took LSD legally as a paid volunteer in a study at the Menlo Park Veterans Hospital in 1959. The experience rearranged him. He described the landscape of his own consciousness, opened up under LSD as more real than anything he had encountered in ordinary waking life, a provocation if you're the kind of person inclined to find it one. He subsequently took a job as a ward attendant at the same hospital, partly to continue having access to the drugs being studied there. The time he spent on the psychiatric ward, observing how mental patients were treated by an institution that simultaneously pitied and feared them, informed One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest directly. The novel was published in 1962 and made him famous. By 1964, Kesey had gathered around him a loose, shifting collective of friends, fellow writers, artists, and general enthusiasts at his property in La Honda, California. They called themselves the Merry Pranksters, though the name was somewhat misleading. They were not merely jokers, but people engaged in what Kesey framed as a genuine philosophical and experiential project. LSD, which remained legal until 1966, was central to that project. The pranksters consumed it regularly and in quantity, and the question they were pursuing, roughly, what would it mean to live without the filters and limitations that conventional consciousness imposes, was one they were attempting to answer practically rather than theoretically. In the summer of '64, Kesey and the pranksters drove a painted school bus called Further across the country to New York, filming the journey and distributing LSD to anyone interested. They arrived at the New York World's Fair. They attended a party at Timothy Leary's research commune in Millbrook. They turned around and drove back. The journey became the subject of Tom Wolfe's 1968 book The Electric Kool-Aid Acid Test, which brought the story to a mainstream audience and in doing so made Kesey and his circle into cultural figures of a specific kind, people who represented not just a lifestyle, but a proposition about consciousness, freedom, and the limitations of straight America. The acid tests, parties held in rented venues in the Bay Area beginning in late 1965, featuring the Grateful Dead and their wall-shaking sound system, light shows projected from multiple angles, and LSD freely available to whoever showed up, were the organised expression of this proposition. They were not concerts in any conventional sense. They were experiments in collective experience, attempts to produce in a crowd of several hundred people something that approximated the dissolution of individual boundaries that high-dose LSD could produce in a single individual. Whether they succeeded is a matter of perspective. What they unquestionably did was introduce LSD to a much wider audience than the research community or the literary underground had reached, and launch a cultural moment that would outgrow everyone involved in it. If Ken Kesey was the ringleader, Timothy Leary was the prophet, and the distinction matters, because prophets attract more institutional hostility. Leary was a Harvard psychologist, credentialed and respectable, born in 1920 in Springfield, Massachusetts, the son of an army officer. His early career was orthodox. He trained in clinical psychology, published serious academic work, and by the late 1950s had achieved genuine professional standing at Harvard as a lecturer and researcher. He was considered charming, sociable, and moderately ambitious. Nothing in his professional record predicted what was coming. He first tried psilocybin mushrooms during a vacation in Cuernavaca, Mexico, in the summer of 1960. He was 39 years old. He ate a handful of mushrooms offered by a local guide, lay in the sun by a swimming pool, and reported afterward that he had learned more about the mind in those 4 hours than in all his previous years of studying psychology. He returned to Harvard determined to investigate the therapeutic and psychological potential of psilocybin, and together with his colleague Richard Alpert, a psychologist who would later leave the field entirely, travel to India, and return as Ram Dass, one of the central figures of the American spiritual movement. He established the Harvard Psilocybin Project. The project conducted studies on personality change, creativity, and spiritual experience, administering psilocybin to graduate students, prisoners, and divinity school students. The last of these produced what became known as the Good Friday Experiment, a double-blind study in which half a group of divinity students received psilocybin and half received niacin, a B vitamin used as an active placebo, during a religious service. The psilocybin group reported overwhelmingly mystical experiences that they described as among the most meaningful of their lives. Many of these reports were still being described in the same terms decades later at follow-up interviews. But the project attracted controversy almost immediately. Students were reporting that their psilocybin sessions were changing them in fundamental ways, changing their values, their vocational directions, their relationships, and Harvard's administration was not sure it wanted its psychology department in the business of fundamentally changing people. Leary and Albert were dismissed from Harvard in 1963. Albert for giving psilocybin to an undergraduate in violation of an agreement not to, Leary for absences from campus. Both dismissals were presented officially as administrative matters. The cultural consequences were anything but administrative. Leary, freed from the constraints of academic employment, reconstituted himself as something new. Part researcher, part evangelist, part performance artist. He founded a commune in Millbrook, New York. He gave lectures and press conferences. He coined and repeated in every available forum the phrase that became inseparable from his name: turn on, tune in, drop out. He meant it seriously, as an instruction to use psychedelics to make contact with one's own nature, to understand the cultural programming one had absorbed, and to step back from a social system one found inadequate. The media heard it as an instruction to abandon responsibility and reported it accordingly. President Nixon called him the most dangerous man in America. Leary seemed genuinely amused. The FBI's file on him eventually ran to several hundred pages. He was arrested, tried, convicted on marijuana charges in 1970, escaped from prison with help from the Weather Underground, fled to Algeria, was recaptured in Afghanistan in 1973, and spent several more years incarcerated before his release in 1976. He spent the remaining 2 decades of his life writing, lecturing, and insisting that he had been right. He died in 1996 in his own home in Beverly Hills while on an experimental palliative LSD regimen. He found this, by all reports, extremely appropriate. It would be historically irresponsible to discuss the cultural history of LSD without spending significant time on the music, because what happened to popular music between 1965 and 1968 is one of the most concentrated periods of sonic transformation in the 20th century, and LSD was sitting in the centre of it like a very unusual engine. The Beatles first tried LSD in 1965, reportedly without their knowledge, given to them at a dinner party by their dentist, John Riley, who added it to their after-dinner coffee. This is a sentence that takes a moment to sit with properly. A dentist, at dinner, in the coffee. George Harrison later described leaving the dinner and feeling as though they were inside a giant submarine. John Lennon said he was convinced the lift in their building was on fire. The shift in the Beatles' recorded output over the following year is not subtle. Rubber Soul, released in December of '65, is recognisably different in texture and intention from everything before it. More inward, more meditative, more interested in emotional ambiguity and sonic experimentation. Revolver, in August of '66, pushed further. Backward recordings, unconventional time signatures, orchestrations that seem to map psychological states rather than support melodic structures, lyrics that operated simultaneously on multiple levels. Tomorrow Never Knows, closing the album, was based directly on instructions from the Psychedelic Experience, a guidebook co-authored by Leary, adapted from the Tibetan Book of the Dead. The song tells the listener to turn off their mind, relax, and float downstream. It is built on a single sustained chord, and what sounds like a recording of the end of everything. Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band, released in June of '67 and coinciding almost exactly with the Summer of Love, became the defining artifact of the psychedelic moment. But the Beatles were not operating in isolation. The Byrds had been experimenting with LSD since '65 and produced 8 Miles High, which Columbia Records attempted to ban from radio, concerned it was a drug reference. It was a drug reference, though the band denied it. Jefferson Airplane formed in San Francisco in '65 with the explicit intention of creating music for the psychedelic experience. Grace Slick's White Rabbit, released in '67, referenced both Alice in Wonderland and a specific instruction to pay attention to what you're being told when your mind is fully open. The song went to number 8 on the Billboard Hot 100. The people buying it knew exactly what it was about. Jimi Hendrix, arriving in London in '66, encountered LSD in the milieu of the British music scene and produced an entire body of work that sounds, even today, as though it is transmitting from somewhere slightly outside ordinary three-dimensional space. The Doors, Pink Floyd, Cream, Traffic, Country Joe and The Fish, the list of acts whose sound was directly shaped by psychedelic experience is so comprehensive that it's easier to list the major acts of the period who were not involved. What LSD gave these musicians, or what they took from it, was permission primarily. Permission to abandon conventional song structures, to pursue sonic experiments without regard for radio format, to make music that was about the interior life rather than the social performance of emotion. Whether the music would have emerged anyway is unknowable. What is clear is that it emerged when it did, and LSD was in the room. In the summer of 1967, approximately 100,000 young people descended on the Haight-Ashbury neighborhood of San Francisco. They came from everywhere, from small towns in the Midwest, from university campuses on the East Coast, from suburbs that had given them every material comfort except a reason to stay, and they arrived with sleeping bags, acoustic guitars, second-hand jewellery, and in quantities that the local pharmacy could not have supplied, LSD. What followed was an event that has been mythologized so thoroughly in the decades since that even the people who were there sometimes struggle to see it clearly through the accumulated layers of nostalgia and retrospective disappointment. Haight-Ashbury had been building toward this for years. The neighbourhood, a district of Victorian row houses that had declined in the post-war years, had been colonised in the early 60s by artists, poets and students priced out of North Beach. By 65 it had a distinct culture: the Oracle newspaper, the diggers who distributed free food in Golden Gate Park, the Psychedelic shop on Haight Street where you could buy drug paraphernalia alongside books about Eastern philosophy. The Grateful Dead had moved into a house on Ashbury Street. Janis Joplin was in the neighbourhood. Jefferson Airplane were around the corner. The Human Be-In, held in Golden Gate Park in January of '67, drew an estimated 20 to 30,000 people to hear Timothy Leary, Allen Ginsberg, Jerry Rubin, and the Grateful Dead. It was intentionally not a protest event. It was a gathering for its own sake, a demonstration that this many people could assemble in peace, in joy, in a state of collective openness facilitated for many of them by LSD. Owsley Stanley, the underground chemist, manufactured a special batch of LSD called White Lightning for the occasion. It was distributed free. The event was peaceful and beautiful and generated enormous media coverage. By summer, the media coverage had become a problem. Runaway teenagers were arriving in Haight-Ashbury having seen the coverage and expecting the Summer of Love to provide them with food, shelter and a sense of belonging. The neighbourhood's actual infrastructure, the free clinics, the crash pads, the diggers' food programme could not accommodate them. The Haight became, over the course of the summer, simultaneously a genuine community of shared idealism and a street scene of serious deprivation. Hepatitis spread. Runaways went missing. People had bad trips in public without anyone capable of helping them. The diggers organised a ceremony at the end of the summer called the Death of Hippie, carrying a coffin through the streets of the hate to announce that the media's construction of the counterculture was over. They were right that something was over. They were wrong about how quietly it would end. October 6th, 1966 is the day LSD became illegal in California, and the federal prohibition followed in 1968 under the Controlled Substances Act. The question of why, the actual mechanisms, is more complicated than it is usually presented. The simple version is that the drug was criminalized because of its association with the counterculture and the threat that counterculture posed to social order. This is partly true and partly a post hoc simplification of a more tangled process. The pharmaceutical company Sandoz, which had been distributing Delysid freely to researchers since 1947, became alarmed in the mid-60s by the cultural visibility of the drug and the association being drawn between their product and chaos, bad trips, and countercultural rebellion. In 1966, they voluntarily withdrew Delysid from the market and recalled all outstanding samples. This was not a regulatory decision. It was a business decision by a company that did not want to be the pharmaceutical firm whose product was appearing in newspaper story about teenagers losing their minds at rock concerts. The withdrawal of the legitimate supply did not reduce demand. It redirected it to underground production. The regulatory response at the state and then federal level was driven by a convergence of genuine public health concern, political utility, and media-generated panic. The genuine concern was real. Emergency room admissions involving bad trips were occurring, and the lack of any regulatory framework meant that LSD was being consumed by people with no guidance, no preparation, and no support. This was a predictable consequence of moving a powerful compound from a supervised clinical setting to an uncontrolled street market, and it was exactly what the psychiatric researchers had warned would happen. Their warnings were by this point being drowned out. The political utility was considerable. The Nixon administration, which took office in January of '69, had explicitly linked the anti-war movement, the counterculture, and drug use in its political communications, and found the association useful. John Ehrlichman, Nixon's domestic policy chief, stated in a 1994 interview, with the bluntness of a man who knew he was not going to face consequences, that the Nixon administration had two enemies: the anti-war left and black Americans. Heroin was associated with black Americans. LSD was associated with the anti-war left. Making both drugs illegal gave the administration the ability to arrest the leaders of these groups and disrupt their communities without having to mention their actual motivation. The war on drugs was, at its point of origin, a political weapon. This is not a conspiracy theory. It is a quote from the man who helped design it. The chromosome damage claim, which swept through the media in 1967, accelerated the political case for prohibition. The original study found no such damage in controlled conditions. Follow-up research failed to replicate it. The original authors subsequently published corrections. None of this received anywhere near the media coverage that the initial false claim had generated. By the time the scientific consensus had quietly settled the matter, the political process was already complete. Before the Controlled Substances Act made LSD manufacture a federal crime, and for some years afterward, the primary domestic source of high-quality LSD in the United States was not a pharmaceutical company or a government laboratory. It was Augustus Owsley Stanley III, known to everyone as Bear, a self-taught chemist, obsessive audiophile, and person of strong convictions who had arrived at LSD through the Kesey Circle, and decided that the public needed better access to a reliably pure product. He did not consider himself a drug dealer. He considered himself, with complete sincerity, to be performing a public service. Owsley was born in 1935 in Kentucky, the grandson of a United States Senator. He was brilliant, difficult, and possessed of the kind of absolute confidence in his own judgment that can look indistinguishable from arrogance until it is proven correct. He dropped out of the University of Virginia, joined the Air Force, left the Air Force, drifted to California, enrolled briefly at Berkeley, and somewhere in this period encountered LSD and chemistry simultaneously. He had no formal training in organic synthesis. He taught himself from textbooks and from first principles. The LSD he produced in his first laboratory, set up in a Berkeley apartment in 1964, was by the account of everyone who sampled it remarkably pure and consistent. He began distributing it through the Kesey network and then more broadly, pricing it at $2 per dose wholesale, enough to cover costs and support his operation, but low enough to keep it accessible. He moved his operations several times as he grew more sophisticated. At one point he was operating from a house in Point Richmond, at another from a property in Orinda. He produced what he later estimated at around 500,000 doses by the time of his first arrest in 1967, and by various accounts possibly twice that. His product bore names, White Lightning, Purple Haze, Blue Cheer, that became brand names in the underground market, brands that carried a meaning. This came from Bear, and Bear's product is reliable. He funded the Grateful Dead in their early years. He provided their sound equipment, toured with them, and eventually designed their wall of sound speaker system, a massive, technically sophisticated array that was revolutionary in its own right, and that he built because he found commercially available concert sound systems aesthetically unacceptable. His connection with the Dead was, in that sense, characteristic. He arrived in someone's orbit with resources and expertise, inserted himself into the operation, and improved it according to his own standards. He was arrested in 1967 at his Point Richmond laboratory and convicted of LSD manufacture. He was arrested again in 1970 and eventually served 2 years in federal prison. He was, by this point, a legend. His name was in the songs. The Blue Cheer band named themselves after his product. His face was on the cover of Rolling Stone. He spent his post-prison years in various pursuits: metalwork, sound engineering, cattle ranching in Australia, where he believed the continent to be the safest place in a coming global catastrophe. He died in a car accident near his property in Queensland in 2011. He was 76 years old. The obituaries could not agree on how many doses of LSD he had produced. The estimates range from 1 million to 10 million. He was probably the most consequential amateur chemist of the 20th century. There is a version of the LSD story that exists only in terms of transcendence, of expanding consciousness, cosmic insight, and the kind of revelatory afternoon that produces either great art or a sincere commitment to Buddhist practice. That version is real. It is also incomplete. For a significant and important minority of people who have taken LSD, the experience has been terrifying, destabilizing, and in some cases genuinely traumatic. Acknowledging this is not a concession to the scare narratives that drove criminalization. It is an accurate account of what the compound actually does to all kinds of people in all kinds of circumstances. The mechanisms of a bad trip are reasonably well understood at this point. LSD amplifies psychological material. It does not manufacture content from nothing. It takes what is already present in the mind and magnifies it, reduces the filters that normally keep it in the background, and strips away the habitual cognitive strategies that people use to manage difficult emotions and thoughts. In a person who is psychologically stable, in a safe environment, With trusted companions and a positive intention, this amplification can produce experiences of extraordinary beauty and insight. In a person who is anxious, in an environment that feels unsafe, with companions who are unreliable, it can produce the opposite. The paranoia that LSD can generate is not gentle philosophical uncertainty. It is the full visceral conviction that something is terribly wrong, that the people around you cannot be trusted, that the self is dissolving and will not reassemble. The sense of ego dissolution, the loss of the boundary between self and world, is, for many people, one of the most meaningful aspects of the experience. For others, it is one of the most frightening things a human nervous system can produce. The distinction between those responses is shaped by preparation, context, and individual psychological history in ways that are not fully predictable. People who have previously experienced panic disorder, trauma, or psychotic episodes are at meaningfully higher risk of a difficult experience. People in unstable emotional situations, grieving or in crisis, are more vulnerable than they might be in calmer periods of their lives. The phenomenon of HPPD, hallucinogen persisting perception disorder, affects a small subset of LSD users and involves visual disturbances that persist after the drug has fully metabolized. Geometric patterns in peripheral vision, trails left by moving objects, visual snow, after images that linger longer than normal. For most people who experience these symptoms, they are mild and fade gradually. For a smaller number, they are persistent and interfere with daily functioning. The precise mechanism is not fully understood, but research suggests lasting changes in how the visual cortex processes incoming information. Risk factors appear to include prior psychiatric history, high doses, and frequent use. The most serious risk, the induction of a psychotic episode in a person with an underlying vulnerability to psychosis, particularly schizophrenia, is real, documented, and important. The evidence suggests that LSD does not cause schizophrenia in people with no predisposition, but that in people who carry a genetic vulnerability, particularly in adolescence when the brain's dopamine systems are still developing, a powerful psychedelic experience can trigger an episode that might not otherwise have occurred or might have occurred much later. This risk is not hypothetical. It is one of the strongest arguments for ensuring that LSD use, if it is to occur at all, happens in context with appropriate screening, preparation, and support, which is, not incidentally, exactly what the clinical researchers of the 1950s and 60s were providing before the research was shut down and the drug moved to the street. Albert Hofmann lived to be 102 years old, dying in April of 2008, 65 years and 1 day after his famous bicycle ride. That specificity feels significant. The man who discovered the most powerful psychedelic compound in history outlived almost everyone who had been shaped by that discovery, and spent decades watching, with a complicated mixture of feelings, what the world did with what he had made. He called LSD his problem child, a phrase that became the title of his memoir published in 1980 in German and translated into English in 1983, and the phrase carried everything it needed to: the pride of a parent, the grief of a parent, the bewilderment of a parent whose child has made choices that cannot be taken back. He retired from Sandoz in 1971, having spent his career there in productive and distinguished work on ergot alkaloids and other natural compounds, and moved to a house in the Swiss countryside where he gardened, wrote, corresponded, and continued to think about the questions that LSD had forced on him. He described several LSD experiences he had taken in carefully controlled personal settings over the years as among the most profound experiences of his life, experiences of mystical union with nature, of the dissolution of the boundary between self and world. of a quality of consciousness that he could not access through any other means. He was not ambivalent about the drug's value in these contexts. He was clear that it had given him something genuine and important. What he was ambivalent about was everything else. He was distressed by the McUltra revelations when they became public in the 1970s, by the knowledge that a compound he had made had been used to torture and manipulate people. He was distressed by the bad trips, the accidents, the tragedies that had accumulated in the decades of uncontrolled street use. He was deeply frustrated by the criminalization that had shut down research he considered urgently important. He believed, consistently and publicly, that the restriction of LSD to Schedule I status in the United States and similar classifications elsewhere was a catastrophic error, that it had cut short a research program of incalculable therapeutic value on the basis of political rather than scientific reasoning. In his final decades, he watched the early stirrings of the psychedelic renaissance with something that looked like relief. He corresponded with researchers at the institutions beginning to conduct new trials. He attended conferences. He wrote, at advanced age, with remarkable clarity. At the symposium held in Basel in 2006 to mark the 100th anniversary of his birth, attended by over 2,000 scientists, researchers, therapists, and interested observers from around the world, he stood on a stage in his home city and received a standing ovation from people who had travelled from 6 continents to be there. He was 99 years old. He died 2 years later in his home in the countryside he had loved. He had said, in the years before his death, that he hoped the compound he had made would eventually find its proper place in medicine, not as a recreational substance, not as a tool of government manipulation, but as what he had always believed it was, a medicine for the soul. He died before the evidence from the new trials was complete. He would have found it vindicating. Here is a fact that is important to hold in mind when assessing the full arc of LSD's history. From approximately 1970, when the Controlled Substances Act made LSD a Schedule I drug in the United States, until the late 1990s and early 2000s, almost no legitimate scientific research on LSD and its therapeutic applications was conducted anywhere in the world. Not reduced research, not slower research, almost none. A research program that had produced, by the time it was shut down, over 1,000 peer-reviewed papers, treated thousands of patients, and generated substantial evidence of therapeutic value across multiple conditions: alcoholism, end-of-life anxiety, treatment-resistant depression, obsessive disorders, was terminated, essentially overnight, by a regulatory classification that had been driven primarily by politics. To be clear about what Schedule I means in practice, it designates a substance as having no accepted medical use and a high potential for abuse. Under this classification, researchers who want to conduct studies with LSD must obtain approval from the DEA, which is theoretically possible, but practically requires navigating a bureaucratic process so demanding that it effectively deters all but the most determined institutions. The NIDA, the National Institute on Drug Abuse, must also approve funding. IRB approval is required. The DEA must approve the specific research facility as a Schedule I storage site. Each of these approvals takes time, costs money, and can be denied for reasons that are not always transparently scientific. The researchers who had been most active before the shutdown did not stop thinking about what they had found. Stanislav Grof, who had by 1970 conducted over 4,000 LSD-assisted psychotherapy sessions in Prague and Baltimore, and documented them in extraordinary clinical detail, shifted his work in 2 directions. He continued writing about what the LSD sessions had revealed about the structure of the human psyche, producing a series of books that became significant in both psychiatric and spiritual communities. And he developed holotropic breathwork, a non-drug technique combining specific breathing patterns, music, and bodywork that he believed could approximate some of the psychotherapeutic effects of LSD without the legal complications. His books kept the literature alive in academic psychology circles. His workshops kept the clinical tradition alive in practice. Humphrey Osmond spent the remaining decades of his career in academic positions, writing about the sociology of mental illness and continuing to argue for psychedelic research whenever he had a platform. He died in 2004, still arguing. The clinical infrastructure that had been built in the 1950s and 60s, the training programs, the protocols, the accumulated clinical wisdom of 2 decades of supervised sessions, dispersed. People retired. The institutional memory faded. When the new generation of researchers began seeking approval for trials in the late 90s, they were starting in many respects from near zero, not because the earlier knowledge had been disproved, but because the people who held it had spent 30 years unable to practice it. There is no institution in American cultural history more thoroughly identified with LSD than the Grateful Dead, and the identification is not incidental or superficial. The Dead emerged directly from the acid tests. They were, in a very real sense, the house band of Ken Kesey's experimental consciousness project. And they spent the subsequent 3 decades embodying, sonically and socially, a relationship to the drug that was neither the therapeutic model of the researchers nor the political model of the counterculture, but something stranger and more durable than either. A community organised around a shared altered state. The band formed in 1965 in Palo Alto, California, coalescing around the guitarist and songwriter Jerry Garcia, who had been a banjo player in the folk revival before LSD changed his relationship to music and to time. The Dead's early music was already unusual, long, improvisational, structurally unpredictable, but LSD pushed it further into territory that had no precedent. Their live performances were designed in a way that became more deliberate as their career progressed, for audiences in psychedelic states, set lengths of 3 hours and more, set lists that changed every night, improvisations that could extend a single song across 20 minutes of collective musical exploration. The music was not about arriving at a destination. It was about the journey, specifically the journey taken by a crowd of people who were, in significant numbers, having very unusual sensory and cognitive experiences and needed a sonic environment that could hold all of it. Deadheads, the devoted fans who organised their lives around the band's touring schedule, were a sociological phenomenon that had no real parallel. At peak Dead, in the late 80s and early 90s, 30,000 people might follow a single tour from city to city, living out of cars and vans, building a parallel economy in the parking lots of arenas. The lot economy, bootleg recordings, tie-dye clothing, vegetarian food, crystals, beads, and everything else, was a functional commercial ecosystem that operated largely outside the mainstream, governed by informal norms of fairness and generosity that were, by most accounts of participants, generally upheld. It was not universally pleasant. The lot could be squalid. Heroin appeared alongside LSD in the later years, with much darker consequences. And the Dead's association with LSD extended across the full range of the drug's effects, the ecstatic and the disastrous, the revelatory and the destabilizing. Jerry Garcia died in August of 1995 in a residential drug treatment facility from a heart attack complicated by heroin addiction and decades of hard living. He was 53. The Deadhead community's grief was, by all reports, something close to inconsolable. The grief not just for a musician, but for the organising principle of a way of life. The band continues in various configurations, still drawing large audiences, still playing long improvisational sets to audiences that include, without question, people in altered states. The tradition has not ended. It has aged. In 1978, Albert Hofmann co-authored a book with ethnobotanist R. Gordon Wasson and classical scholar Karl Ruck that proposed something extraordinary: that the sacred drink consumed by initiates at the Eleusinian Mysteries, the most important religious rites of ancient Greece, held at Eleusis for nearly 2,000 years, contained a psychedelic compound derived from ergot. The book, called The Road to Eleusis, argued that the kykeon, a barley-based drink consumed by initiates before entering the inner sanctuary, was prepared from ergotized grain, and that the transformative experiences reported by initiates were psychedelic experiences mediated by a naturally occurring compound structurally related to LSD. The Eleusinian Mysteries were celebrated annually at Eleusis, a small city west of Athens, for at least 1,500 years and possibly considerably longer. The rites were attended by initiates from across the Greek world, men and women, Greek citizens and some foreigners, and were among the few Greek religious institutions that crossed social and gender boundaries in this way. What happened inside the sanctuary was, under penalty of death, secret. No initiate was permitted to describe the experience to the uninitiated. The oath of secrecy held so completely that no direct account of the inner rite survives. What we have are oblique references from people who were there, and those references are remarkably consistent. They describe an experience of profound emotional and spiritual transformation, an encounter with something that felt more real than ordinary reality, a dissolution of the fear of death. Cicero wrote that Athens had given the world nothing more valuable than the mysteries. Plato's description of the soul's access to eternal forms in the Phaedrus is widely read as drawing on initiatory experience. Sophocles wrote that those who had attended the mysteries died with a different understanding of death than those who had not. Wasson, who had spent decades investigating the role of psychoactive fungi in religious traditions around the world, he was the ethnobotanist who had brought psilocybin mushrooms to Western attention after his experience with a Mazatec shaman in Mexico in 1957, believed that the kykeon drink was the key. The drink was known to contain barley and the herb pennyroyal mixed with water. Wasson and Ruck proposed that the barley was ergotized, contaminated with ergot tea, and that this contamination was not accidental but deliberate, a carefully managed preparation of a psychedelic sacrament by the priests of Eleusis. Hofmann provided the chemical expertise. He confirmed that ergot growing on barley could produce lysergic acid, amid compounds with psychedelic properties structurally related to LSD, and that these could be extracted in water solution and consumed. The hypothesis remains debated. A 2020 study by archaeochemist Enriqueta Pons and colleagues examined residue from a ceramic vessel found at a site associated with a Greek mystery cult and identified alkaloids consistent with ergot alongside other plant compounds. The question has not been settled, but the possibility that the philosophical and spiritual foundations of Western civilization were partly shaped by chemically induced mystical experiences consumed by its most important thinkers, and that the molecule responsible was a direct chemical ancestor of the one Albert Hofmann synthesized in Basel in 1938, is one that resists being set aside. The bicycle, it seems, may have been going longer than anyone thought. In the early 2010s, a practice that had existed informally for decades in psychedelic research circles suddenly became a mainstream conversation: microdosing. The premise is straightforward. Instead of taking a full perceptual dose of LSD, the 100 to 200 micrograms that produces 8 to 12 hours of dramatically altered consciousness, you take a sub-perceptual dose typically between 5 and 20 micrograms every few days, not enough to hallucinate, not enough to feel high in any conventional sense, enough, according to proponents, to produce subtle but meaningful improvements in focus, creativity, mood, and emotional resilience. The practice was first described systematically by James Federman, a psychologist who had conducted LSD creativity research in the 1960s before the research was shut down in his 2011 book The Psychedelic Explorer's Guide. Federman outlined a protocol, 1 microdose every 3 days, kept at a level well below perceptual threshold, and invited readers who were already using psychedelics to report their experiences as informal citizen researchers. The response was substantial enough that Federman eventually collected thousands of reports from people self-experimenting with microdosing across multiple substances, primarily LSD and psilocybin. The technology industry in particular took enthusiastic notice. Reports began emerging from San Francisco and New York of software engineers, startup founders, and venture capitalists incorporating microdosing into their weekly routines as a cognitive and creative productivity tool discussed in the same matter-of-fact register as intermittent fasting or nootropic supplements. A Rolling Stone article in 2015, followed by extensive coverage in technology publications, brought the phenomenon to mass attention. Eilert Veldman published a memoir in 2017 called A Really Good Day, describing a month of microdosing that she credited with resolving a treatment-resistant mood disorder and saving her marriage. The book reached a mainstream audience. The formal research followed, a randomized controlled trial published in eGlife in 2021, the first blinded study of LSD microdosing in healthy adults, found small but measurable improvements in mood and cognitive flexibility among participants receiving active doses compared to placebo, while also finding that subjective reports of improvement were partially explained by expectancy effects. A larger study published in 2022 found improvements in psychological well-being but no enhancement of cognitive performance on standardized tests. The picture that emerged from the early research literature was of a phenomenon that was real. Something was happening, but more nuanced and variable than the popular narrative suggested. The benefits appeared to be primarily emotional and subjective, rather than cognitive and measurable. Which, for a lot of people dealing with treatment-resistant mood disorders, in a context where legal options were limited, was entirely sufficient. Beginning in the early 2000s, something remarkable began to happen in academic psychiatry. Serious researchers at serious institutions, Johns Hopkins University, New York University, Imperial College London, University of California, Los Angeles, began obtaining regulatory approval to conduct clinical trials using psychedelic compounds in therapeutic settings. The research came back not through the side door but through the front one, with full IRB approval, DA Schedule I research licenses, published protocols and findings submitted to peer-reviewed journals. The initial focus was psilocybin rather than LSD. Psilocybin's shorter duration of action, 4 to 6 hours versus LSD's 8 to 12, made it more practical for clinical protocols that required a therapist to be present throughout the session. Its lower political profile helped too. Psilocybin had not been on the cover of Time magazine, had not been associated with countercultural rebellion at the same scale, and was less immediately triggering for the regulatory and administrative gatekeepers who controlled research access. Roland Griffiths at Johns Hopkins began conducting psilocybin trials in the early 2000s, publishing the first results in Psychopharmacology in 2006. The paper reported that psilocybin produced mystical-type experiences in healthy volunteers, and that these experiences were rated at 2-month follow-up among the most meaningful of the participants' lives. This in a peer-reviewed pharmacology journal. What followed over the next 15 years was a steady accumulation of trial data that, taken together, constituted a genuine evidentiary case for psychedelic-assisted therapy. A Johns Hopkins study published in Journal of Psychopharmacology in 2016 found that psilocybin-assisted therapy produced significant reductions in depression and anxiety in cancer patients facing life-threatening diagnoses, reductions that persisted at 6-month follow-up, with effect sizes larger than those typically seen in antidepressant drug trials. The companion study at NYU, published simultaneously, found equivalent results. A Johns Hopkins smoking cessation trial found that psilocybin-assisted therapy produced abstinence in 80% of participants at 6-month follow-up, roughly 3 times the success rate of the best available pharmaceutical interventions. LSD-specific research followed more slowly but followed nonetheless. Swiss researchers at the University Hospital Basel, operating under Switzerland's more permissive regulatory framework, conducted a Phase 2 trial examining LSD-assisted psychotherapy for anxiety associated with life-threatening illness, publishing results in 2014 showing significant reductions in anxiety. Further Swiss trials examining LSD's effect on pain, on addiction, and on mood disorders have followed since. The FDA granted breakthrough therapy designation to psilocybin for treatment-resistant depression in 2018 and for major depressive disorder in 2019, a designation that expedites the development of drugs showing substantial improvement over existing therapies. The clinical momentum has been building with a speed that, given the 30-year freeze, feels something like urgency making up for lost time. If the psychedelic renaissance has a single institutional engine, it is the Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelic Studies, MAPS, founded in 1986 by a graduate student named Rick Doblin, who had read about the closure of psychedelic research programs in the 1970s and decided that the appropriate response was to spend the next several decades methodically working to reopen them. This was not a decision made in the heat of youthful idealism and abandoned when the difficulty of the project became clear. Doblin spent 40 years on it. Doblin was born in 1953 and came to psychedelics through personal experience in the 1970s during his college years. He had a difficult time integrating the experiences and spent time working at a hospital that was attempting to help people having psychedelic crises. The combination of a powerful personal encounter with altered states and a front-row view of what happened when those states were unsupported convinced him that the problem was not the drug, but the absence of clinical infrastructure, the absence, specifically, of trained therapists working within regulatory frameworks that allowed them to help people safely. He applied to Harvard's Kennedy School of Government and wrote his senior thesis on the regulation of the medical use of psychedelics. He enrolled in a doctorate program at Harvard and wrote his dissertation on FDA-approved clinical trials of psychedelic psychotherapy. He was playing a very long game. MAPS's strategy was, and remains, an exercise in working within systems rather than against them. Rather than advocating loudly for the cultural value of psychedelics, a framing that had worked poorly in the past, Doblin pursued the FDA's clinical trial pathway with rigorous discipline. This meant funding research to the standard required for pharmaceutical approval, randomized controlled trials, blinded where feasible, with validated outcome measures, reported in peer-reviewed journals, submitted to regulatory bodies for review. It meant engaging with the DEA and FDA as partners in a regulatory process rather than obstacles to be circumvented. It meant hiring researchers and therapists with impeccable credentials and presenting the work in the language of evidence-based medicine. The primary focus of MAPS's clinical program was MDMA-assisted psychotherapy for PTSD, a different compound from LSD, but the regulatory and methodological principles were identical. The MDMA trials reached phase 3, the final stage before potential FDA approval, and the results were striking enough to attract significant attention from the mainstream psychiatric community. The FDA approved MDMA-assisted therapy for PTSD review in 2023, though the approval process encountered complications at the advisory committee stage that delayed final decision. Whether or not MDMA-assisted therapy achieves full FDA approval, the process that MAPS built, the clinical infrastructure, the training programs for therapists, the regulatory pathway, provides the template that LSD researchers are following. Among the concepts that the psychedelic research community has contributed to psychology, the one with perhaps the broadest applicability is the idea of set and setting, a phrase coined by Timothy Leary in the 1960s, but subsequently validated by decades of clinical research. Set refers to the mindset the user brings to the experience, their current psychological state, their expectations, their relationship to their own emotional history, their intentions for the session. Setting refers to the physical and social environment in which the drug is taken. The room, the music, the lighting, the presence or absence of trusted companions, the quality of the relationships present. These are not peripheral variables. Research has consistently demonstrated that they are constitutive of the LSD experience, in a way that has no real parallel in conventional pharmacology. If you give someone a standard dose of ibuprofen in a cheerful room with good music, and then give another person the same dose in a frightening room with an untrustworthy companion, you get approximately the same analgesic effect. If you give someone a standard dose of LSD in a carefully prepared therapeutic setting, with a trained guide present, in a comfortable room with appropriate music, after thorough psychological preparation, you get one kind of experience. If you give the same person the same dose at a chaotic party, surrounded by strangers, with no preparation, no support, you get something categorically different. The pharmacology is the same. The experience is not. The clinical settings developed over decades of research reflect this understanding in their design. Johns Hopkins and the other leading research programs use rooms that look more like living rooms than medical facilities. Comfortable sofas, soft lighting, carefully curated playlists. 2 trained therapists are present throughout the session. Participants undergo multiple preparatory sessions before the drug day, developing a therapeutic relationship with their guides and exploring the psychological material they expect to encounter. They're given an eye mask and encouraged to focus inward rather than engaging with the external environment. Integration sessions follow the drug day, providing space to process what emerged. The music used in these sessions, typically a carefully assembled playlist moving from gentle ambient music through more emotionally intense material and back to resolution, has been the subject of its own research. Studies have found that the music significantly shapes the emotional and experiential quality of psilocybin and LSD sessions, and that specific musical choices correlate with specific types of experience. This is not surprising given what LSD does to auditory processing, the way it intensifies and transforms the emotional impact of sound, but it is a finding with practical implications for how therapeutic sessions are designed. The broader implication of the set and setting research is one that reaches far beyond psychedelics. That context, expectation, and relationship are not just background conditions for drug effects, but active ingredients in them. The environment is part of the medicine. Among the most quietly extraordinary chapters in LSD's medical history is its application in palliative care, the treatment of terminally ill patients facing death. Beginning in the late 1950s and continuing through the 1960s, researchers, including Eric Kast at the Chicago Medical School, began administering LSD to patients with terminal cancer, not to treat the cancer, but to address the psychological suffering that attends dying. the anxiety, the existential dread, the fear of annihilation, the isolation that terminal illness imposes. These are not small problems. Studies of terminally ill patients consistently find that anxiety and depression in the final months of life are significant sources of suffering, often inadequately treated by available medications and profoundly affecting quality of life and the ability to find meaning in remaining time. Cast's early reports were striking in ways that surprised even him. Patients who had been severely distressed reported after LSD sessions a reduction in death anxiety that lasted weeks. More unexpectedly, many described a changed relationship to their approaching death that was not merely a reduction in fear, but something more fundamental, a direct encounter with the reality of mortality that paradoxically made it less frightening rather than more. Patients used language about their sessions that resembled the language of mystical experience, a sense of unity, a dissolution of the boundary between self and the larger world, an understanding of death as a transition rather than an ending, a feeling of peace that was not manufactured or imposed but felt from the inside, like genuine recognition. Stanislav Grof, working first in Prague and later at the Spring Grove State Hospital in Baltimore, conducted over 200 LSD-assisted sessions with terminal cancer patients through the 1960s and early 70s and documented his findings in extraordinary detail. He noted that patients who reported the most profound mystical experiences during their sessions showed the most significant and lasting reductions in death anxiety, depression and pain. Not just psychological pain, but physical pain, a finding consistent with LSD's effects on pain perception that Cast had documented earlier. The integration of the experience, worked through in psychotherapy sessions following the drug day, appeared to be essential. The session produced the experience, but the therapy helped patients find meaning in it. 50 years later, the Johns Hopkins and NYU cancer anxiety trials produced results that were almost identical. Patients receiving psilocybin in a single guided session showed dramatic reductions in depression and anxiety that persisted at 6-month follow-up, effect sizes that, as the researchers wrote in their published papers, were rarely seen in psychiatric research. At 8-hour follow-up after the session, 83% of participants showed a significant response. At 6 months, effects were maintained. The language patients used to describe their experiences, the dissolution of fear, the encounter with something larger than the individual self, the sense that death was not what they had imagined, echoed Groff's documentation from half a century earlier with an exactness that was almost eerie. The patients were different. The decades were different. The drug was different. The human experience of facing death and of what helped had apparently not changed at all. Few aspects of LSD's cultural image are more persistently misunderstood than the flashback, the supposed phenomenon by which LSD trips spontaneously recur days, weeks, or years after the original experience without any additional drug consumption. In the popular imagination, the flashback is a kind of time bomb. You take LSD once, and then at random, unpredictable moments for the rest of your life, you might suddenly find yourself back inside the experience, driving on a highway, sitting in a meeting, standing in line at the grocery store, while reality dissolves around you. This version of the flashback, as a full spontaneous recurrence of the complete psychedelic state, triggered without warning by nothing in particular, is, in the clinical literature, essentially a myth. It does not appear in documented case series with the frequency or the character that the popular narrative implies. What does exist, in a clinically documented and meaningfully real form, is hallucinogen persisting perception disorder, or HPPD. HPPD is not a flashback in the popular sense. It does not involve a re-experiencing of the full subjective content of a trip. It involves visual phenomena that persist after the drug has cleared the system. Geometric patterns visible in peripheral vision, trails or traces following moving objects, visual snow, a persistent static overlay on the visual field, and afterimages that linger longer than they should. These are perceptual phenomena, not psychological re-experiences. The person experiencing them knows where they are, knows what they are experiencing, and is not reliving a previous altered state. They are having unusual visual perceptions in an otherwise normal state of consciousness. For most people who experience HPPD symptoms, they are mild and fade over time, particularly if the person stops using psychedelics and, if relevant, cannabis, which can exacerbate the symptoms. For a smaller and less fortunate subset, the symptoms are persistent, distressing, and interfere significantly with daily life. A person who cannot drive because the visual static makes it unsafe, or who cannot read because the geometric patterns in peripheral vision are distracting, is experiencing a real and serious impairment. The condition has no approved treatment, though several case reports describe improvement with certain anticonvulsants and antidepressants. The mechanism is not fully understood. Current hypotheses center on the possibility that LSD produces lasting changes in the excitability of visual cortex neurons, potentially through effects on inhibitory interneurons, cells that normally dampen neural activity, and whose disruption could lead to the kind of persistent perceptual noise that characterizes HPPD. Why this occurs in some people and not others, and what the risk factors are beyond prior psychiatric history and high-dose use, remains unclear. The research base is thin because studying a condition that develops after illegal drug use requires either self-report from people who have used illegal drugs, or waiting for clinical presentations in a context where clinicians may not be familiar with the condition. The gap between what is known and what would need to be known to help people who have it is considerable. What is clear is that the condition is real. It is not what the popular mythology describes, and it is one of the genuine risks associated with LSD use. A risk that is far less dramatic than the flashback myth, but far more concrete and far more worth understanding accurately. By the end of 1969, the cultural narrative around LSD had shifted dramatically enough that what had seemed, 2 years earlier, like the leading edge of a new kind of civilization now seemed to many of its former participants like something that had ended badly. Two events, arriving in close succession, concentrated the shift with a finality that no amount of subsequent revisionism has entirely dissolved. They did not cause the end of the counterculture. The end had been coming for structural reasons that went well beyond any single event. But they gave the end a face, and that face was violent. Altamont happened on December the 6th, 1969, at the Altamont Speedway east of San Francisco. The Rolling Stones, touring in support of Let It Bleed, organised a free concert as a West Coast counterpart to Woodstock. The Hells Angels were hired to provide security in exchange for $500 worth of beer. Whether the decision to hire the Hells Angels was catastrophically naive, catastrophically arrogant, or catastrophically both has been debated ever since. What is not debated is what happened during the Stones set. A young man named Meredith Hunter, 18 years old and black, pushed toward the front of the crowd. An altercation developed. Hunter drew a gun. A Hells Angel stabbed him repeatedly. He died. A film crew hired by the Stones to document the concert captured the killing on camera. The footage was included in Gimme Shelter, released the following year, and the event became, through that film, one of the defining images of the decade's ending. The Manson family murders had occurred 4 months earlier in August, and the connections drawn between Charles Manson and the counterculture, the communal living, the free love, the drug use including LSD, were reductive but not fabricated. Manson had spent time in Haight-Ashbury. He had used LSD extensively in the manipulation of his followers, dosing them repeatedly in controlled environments to produce states of psychological dependence and submission. This was not what Leary had meant. It was not what the researchers had found. But it was what had happened in the same cultural space, using the same substance, and the public was not in a position to make fine distinctions. The 1970s began with the sense of a door closing. The people who had believed most sincerely in the transformative potential of the psychedelic experience retreated into smaller communities, spiritual practice, and a kind of private knowledge. The public narrative around LSD became overwhelmingly negative. The research was already shut down. The drug was in prison. The decade moved on toward disco and cocaine and the deliberately cynical anti-idealism that would define much of its cultural tone. The problem child had, for the moment, been grounded. Whether it would ever be let out again was a question that, in 1970, seemed to have only one answer. One of the most consistent and underreported dangers associated with illegal LSD use is not LSD itself, but the impossibility of quality control in an unregulated supply chain. A pharmaceutical-grade LSD preparation contains a precisely measured quantity of the compound, verified by analytical chemistry, in a consistent carrier. A street tab of unknown provenance may contain anything from 15 to 300 micrograms of LSD, a 20-fold variation, or it may contain no LSD at all, replaced by a structurally distinct compound sold under the same name. The user has no way to know. The consequences of this uncertainty range from inconvenient to catastrophic. The rise of novel psychoactive substances, compounds synthesized specifically to produce effects similar to scheduled drugs, while remaining, at least temporarily, outside the legal definitions of existing drug laws, has made the adulteration problem significantly more serious in recent decades. The Enbomé family of compounds, discovered in the early 2000s and spreading through the illicit market from approximately 2010 onward, are sold on blotter paper in exactly the same format as LSD, are active at doses measured in micrograms, and are visually indistinguishable from the genuine article. They are not LSD. They bind to serotonin receptors in overlapping but distinct ways, have a narrower safety margin than LSD, and have been associated with multiple deaths. Deaths caused not by LSD but by compounds being sold as LSD to buyers who had no reason to suspect they were receiving anything different. Harm reduction organizations in the United States and Europe have documented hundreds of samples sold as LSD that contained Enbomé compounds instead. The solution to this problem, in the view of harm reduction specialists, is drug checking, services that allow people to test the substances they intend to consume before consuming them. Reagent test kits, available commercially in most jurisdictions, can identify the presence of LSD and distinguish it from the most common adulterants. More sophisticated analytical services, using mass spectrometry, can provide full chemical profiles. These services have been operated at festivals and in clinical settings in several European countries and in some North American jurisdictions, and the evidence is consistent. When people learn that the substance they have is not what they believed, a significant proportion of them choose not to take it. This is what harm reduction looks like in practice, not endorsement of drug use, but reduction of the consequences of drug use that is happening regardless. The broader principle here is one that the history of LSD illustrates with particular clarity. When a substance with real pharmacological effects is prohibited rather than regulated, the harms associated with it do not disappear. They shift. They become less visible, more concentrated among the most vulnerable, and less amenable to clinical intervention. The psychiatrists of the 1950s who were conducting supervised sessions with pharmaceutical-grade LSD in carefully prepared settings were not creating street acid casualties. The street acid casualties appeared after the supervised sessions were shut down. This is not a complicated causal chain. It is simply what happens. One of the most intriguing phenomena associated with high-dose LSD use, and the one that has attracted the most attention from contemporary neuroscientists, is ego dissolution. The temporary loss of the sense of being a separate self, the dissolution of the boundary between individual and world, the subjective experience that the self has ceased to exist as a distinct entity and has merged with something larger. This is a phenomenon that appears across a remarkable range of human experiences. Deep meditation, near-death experiences, certain types of epileptic aura, fever states, and, with notable consistency and intensity, high-dose psychedelic use. The consistency of the reports across such different contexts suggests that what is being described is a genuine and identifiable state of consciousness, rather than a culturally specific interpretation. Robin Carhart Harris and his colleagues at Imperial College London, and subsequently at UC San Francisco, have used fMRI imaging to study the neural correlates of LSD-induced ego dissolution, and the findings have been among the most widely discussed in contemporary neuroscience. The default mode network, a set of interconnected brain regions including the medial prefrontal cortex, the posterior cingulate cortex, and the angular gyrus, that are consistently active during self-referential thought, mind-wandering, social cognition, and the construction of autobiographical narrative, become significantly less active during LSD-induced ego dissolution. The brain's normal background state, the constant maintenance of the sense of self and its narrative continuity, appears to require this network's activity. When the network is suppressed by LSD, the self becomes optional. Simultaneously, functional connectivity between brain regions that do not normally communicate directly increases dramatically. The brain under high-dose LSD shows what the researchers describe as increased global connectivity, more communication across more pairs of regions, and a relative breakdown of the modular organization that normally keeps different functional networks separate. Regions involved in visual processing communicate more freely with regions involved in semantic processing, which corresponds phenomenologically to the synesthesia and the unusually vivid, meaning-saturated quality of perceptual experience under LSD. Regions involved in emotional processing communicate more freely with regions involved in sensory experience, which corresponds to the emotional intensity with which ordinary perceptions can be experienced. Carhart Harris and his collaborators have proposed a theoretical framework called Rebus, Relaxed Beliefs Under Psychedelics, to describe the mechanism. In this model, the brain normally operates as a hierarchical prediction machine, with high-level beliefs and expectations constantly shaping the interpretation of incoming sensory information in a top-down manner. LSD relaxes this hierarchy, allowing sensory information to have more influence on perception and reducing the extent to which high-level beliefs constrain what can be experienced. This framework has implications for therapeutic applications if maladaptive beliefs and expectations are part of what maintains conditions like depression, PTSD, and addiction. If the brain is stuck in deeply grooved patterns of interpretation that filter out disconfirming experience, then a temporary relaxation of the hierarchical constraints might allow those patterns to be updated. This is, in a formalized neuroscientific language, a description of what the clinical researchers of the 1950s were observing in their patients and unable at the time to explain. One of the most persistent beliefs about LSD is that it enhances creativity, that the great albums, novels, and technological innovations of the 1960s and 70s were partly the product of chemically augmented creative capacity, and that LSD gives access to forms of thought and perception not available in ordinary consciousness. The question of whether this belief has scientific support is more complicated than either its advocates or its critics tend to acknowledge, and the honest answer involves a careful distinction between what the research actually shows and what the popular narrative implies. James Fadiman's 1966 study, conducted at the Stanford Research Institute shortly before LSD became illegal, is the most frequently cited piece of evidence. He and his colleagues administered subperceptual doses between 50 and 100 micrograms, enough to produce mild effects but not full perceptual alteration, to 27 professionals in technical fields, engineers, architects, mathematicians, and scientists. Each participant came to the session with a specific real-world problem they had been unable to solve by conventional means. Over the course of the session, working individually with the support of a psychedelic state researcher, they engaged with their problems. Several of the solutions generated that day were subsequently patented, published, or implemented. One participant had an insight about a design problem he'd been working on for months. Another resolved a mathematical issue that had stalled his research for years. The study was terminated when LSD became illegal, and its methodology has never been formally replicated in peer-reviewed research. More recent research has examined creativity under LSD conditions using validated psychological measures. Tests of divergent thinking, associative fluency, and creative problem-solving. The results are mixed and context-dependent. Some studies find improvements in divergent thinking, the ability to generate many possible answers to an open question at low doses. Others find that the cognitive disruption produced by higher doses actually impairs performance on structured creativity tasks, while increasing the subjective sense of creative engagement. There is, in other words, a potential dissociation between feeling creative and being measurably more creative by external standards. What the research is more consistent about is LSD's effect on cognitive flexibility, specifically, a reduction in the tendency to apply habitual, well-worn approaches to new problems, and an increase in the willingness to consider unusual or counterintuitive possibilities. This is not the same as enhanced creativity in an absolute sense, but it is something genuinely useful in specific contexts. The context where the barrier to a solution is not lack of knowledge or skill, but attachment to a familiar framework. Several prominent figures in the technology industry have credited psychedelic experiences with shifts in their thinking about fundamental problems, shifts that, by their accounts, were not about information but about perspective. Whether those accounts are accurate, whether the shifts were caused by the drug rather than the circumstances around it, and whether the same shifts could be achieved by other means are questions that the available evidence cannot definitively answer. What it can say is that something is happening to cognition under LSD, and that something is not simply random noise. As of the mid-2020s, the legal and cultural landscape around LSD has shifted more dramatically than at any point since the late 1960s, though the shift has been slower, more institutional, and less visible than anything that happened during that earlier period. Clinical trials examining LSD's therapeutic potential are ongoing at multiple research institutions in the United States, Europe, and Australia. The regulatory framework in Switzerland has permitted a degree of clinical research that would have been unimaginable a decade ago. Several pharmaceutical companies have been founded specifically to develop psychedelic therapies, including LSD derivatives, through the FDA approval process, bringing commercial resources and regulatory expertise to the field. The cultural conversation around psychedelics has shifted in ways that would have been difficult to predict even 10 years ago. The publication of Michael Pollan's How to Change Your Mind in 2018, a book by a mainstream journalist with no prior connection to psychedelic culture, examining the new research and the history, reaching a general audience rather than a specialist one there, accelerated a change in public perception that was already underway. Pollan's book described his own experiences with psilocybin, LSD, and other psychedelics under guided conditions, and framed them in the language of curiosity and cautious assessment rather than advocacy. It sold millions of copies. It was followed by a proliferation of podcasts, documentaries, and journalistic coverage that approached psychedelics with the same matter-of-fact seriousness previously reserved for antidepressants and therapy. The policy environment has moved correspondingly. Oregon legalized psilocybin-assisted therapy in 2020. Colorado followed in 2022. Several cities, Denver, Oakland, Ann Arbor, Washington, D.C., have decriminalized personal possession of psychedelics more broadly. The FDA's breakthrough therapy designations for psilocybin and the ongoing clinical trial programs for multiple compounds, including LSD, have created a regulatory pathway that would lead, if the trials continue to produce positive results, to eventual approval for specific therapeutic indications. LSD itself has moved more slowly than psilocybin through this process, partly because of its political history, and partly because its longer duration of action creates practical challenges for clinical protocols. But the direction of travel is unmistakable. What remains is the gap, the significant, important, and still largely unresolved gap between what clinical research is demonstrating and what patients can legally access. A person with treatment-resistant depression, or PTSD unresponsive to available medications, or anxiety in the context of a terminal illness diagnosis, cannot currently walk into a clinic and receive LSD-assisted therapy in most of the world. The research suggests this treatment could help them significantly. The regulatory process that would make it available is in motion but incomplete. In the meantime, people make their own choices, in their own circumstances, with or without guidance, with or without safety. This has been the condition for 50 years. The bicycle is still moving. Let's end where we should end, with what LSD actually did to the world it entered. The honest answer is complicated because LSD's legacy is not a single thing. It is, depending on how you approach it, a story about the limits of utopian thinking, a story about the therapeutic potential that institutional conservatism abandoned for half a century, a story about the relationship between consciousness and chemistry, and a story about what happens when a substance of extraordinary power escapes from the laboratory before anyone has thought carefully about what that means. The cultural impact is measurable in the music, the art, the literature, and the philosophy that the 1960s and 70s produced. Whether that impact was good, on balance, is a question that different reasonable people answer differently, and the answer depends heavily on what you weight. The genuine creative breakthroughs and the genuine experiences of meaning and connection, reported by millions of people, against the tragedies, the bad trips, the destabilized lives, the M-culture victims, the people who made decisions under LSD's influence that caused lasting harm to themselves and others. Both categories are real. Neither cancels the other. The political impact is also real and also complicated. LSD became a symbol of the counterculture in a way that helped define and then helped destroy that culture's political coherence. The association between drug use and the anti-war movement provided the Nixon administration with a legal tool to target and imprison movement leaders. The criminalization of LSD was, in part, a political act against a political movement, and it worked. The movement did not disappear, but it was severely disrupted, and the drug war infrastructure built in that period outlasted the specific political moment that created it by decades. The scientific impact is perhaps the clearest legacy. LSD forced the question of consciousness, what it is, how it arises, what it means for our understanding of the mind, into the center of neuroscience in a way that it had not been before. The neuroscientific tools developed to study psychedelic states have produced insights into normal brain function that have value independent of any therapeutic application. The understanding of the default mode network, of global connectivity, of the hierarchical predictive architecture of the brain. These are contributions to human knowledge that were accelerated by the necessity of explaining what LSD does. The molecule was a probe in the scientific sense, something that, when it disturbs a system, reveals how the system works. The human brain, it turns out, is a system that reveals a great deal about itself when disturbed by the right molecule in the right way. Albert Hofmann was a careful man. He did not set out to change the world. He was investigating a fungus, synthesizing a series of compounds, following a thread of chemical curiosity with the discipline that his training had given him. The thing he made has been used to heal and to harm, to liberate and to manipulate, to inspire and to terrify, in proportions that he spent the last 65 years of his life trying to understand and to influence. He believed to the end that the compound's therapeutic potential had not been realized, that the 30 years of research shutdown represented an enormous and unnecessary loss of human benefit. He may have been right about that. The new research suggests he was right about that. The bicycle keeps moving. The question of what it might become, what place LSD might eventually find in medicine, in culture, in the ongoing human project of trying to understand what consciousness is and what it is for, remains genuinely open, which is in its way exactly where a story this strange deserves to end. And so, here you are, still breathing, still horizontal hopefully, still somewhere soft and warm, which is more than Albert Hofmann could have said for himself on the afternoon of April 19th, 1943, when he was pedalling through the streets of Basel on a bicycle, watching the familiar world dissolve around him into something he had no language for, convinced with complete certainty that he was either dying or had already crossed some threshold from which there was no return. He had not died. He had not crossed any threshold from which there was no return. He had simply encountered, for the first time in human history under controlled circumstances, what the human brain does when you introduce 100 micrograms of a semi-synthetic, ergot derivative to its serotonin receptors and then get out of the way. He woke up the next morning, wrote it all down in his laboratory notebook with the methodical precision of a man who had spent his entire professional life training himself not to be shaken by surprising results, and then ate breakfast. He was fine. The world was fine. The bicycle was presumably fine. But nothing was the same. That is the thing about LSD, that all the arguments, the therapeutic arguments, the political arguments, the neuroscientific arguments, the harm reduction arguments, tend to circle around without quite landing on directly. Nothing was the same after it. Not for Hofmann, who spent the next 65 years of his life trying to understand what he had made, and whether the world would ever find a way to use it wisely. Not for the psychiatric researchers of the 1950s, who saw in it the possibility of a breakthrough that the field of mental health had been waiting for without knowing what shape it would take. Not for the patients in those early clinical trials, the alcoholics who stopped drinking after a single guided session, the terminal cancer patients who described their fear of death shifting into something they could hold without being crushed by it. Not for the musicians who heard the world differently afterward and made records that permanently expanded what popular music was allowed to be. Not for the teenagers who arrived in Haight-Ashbury in the summer of 1967, carrying sleeping bags and a sincere belief that the world could be different, that consciousness was the lever, that enough people changing how they thought might change what they did. And not for the people who had terrible experiences, the ones who were dosed without consent in government laboratories, the ones who encountered the drug on the street with no preparation and no support, and found themselves in a darkness they had not chosen and could not immediately exit, the ones who carried something difficult from a single afternoon for the rest of their lives. LSD did not do one thing to the world. It did everything at once, in all directions, without asking anyone's permission, which is, if you think about it, a fairly accurate description of the 1960s themselves. What you've been listening to tonight is a story about a molecule, but molecules, as Hofmann understood better than almost anyone, are never just molecules. They are always also stories about the people who find them, the institutions that regulate them, the cultures that absorb them, the politics that exploit them, the patients who need them, and the long, complicated, unfinished process by which human beings try to figure out what to do with things that arrive before they are ready. Hofmann's problem child arrived before anyone was ready. The infrastructure, clinical, legal, social, psychological, that might have allowed it to find its proper place simply did not exist yet, and so it found improper places instead. And the consequences were what consequences always are when something powerful arrives in an unprepared world: mixed, painful, extraordinary, and impossible to fully separate into the good and the bad, because the same substance that helped one person find peace with their approaching death was used by a government agency to destroy another person's sense of reality without their knowledge. The molecule does not distinguish. The humans who use it do or fail to, and the difference between those outcomes is almost entirely about context, preparation, intention, and care. The researchers who are doing the work now, the ones in the carefully designed rooms at Johns Hopkins and Imperial College and the University of Basel, the ones running the clinical trials with their validated outcome measures and their IRB approvals and their meticulous session protocols, understand this with a clarity that was hard-won through decades of watching what happened when the context was wrong. They are not naive utopians. They are not counterculture idealists. They are scientists and clinicians who have looked at the evidence, which is substantial and growing, and concluded that there is something here that medicine has been missing, something that does not fit neatly into the pharmacological model of a drug that corrects a chemical imbalance. Something that works, when it works, by producing an experience, a specific, particular, irreducible kind of experience that changes how a person understands themselves and their relationship to their own suffering and their own death and their own life. You cannot produce that experience by adjusting a dose. You cannot produce it by finding the right receptor target. You produce it by creating the conditions under which a person's mind, temporarily freed from the hierarchical constraints that normally govern it, encounters itself and the world in a new way. And then you sit with them while they do it, and you help them make sense of what they found afterward. This is, in structure, not entirely unlike what a good therapist does, or a good friend, or a good priest, or a good grandmother who has lived long enough to know that some things cannot be reasoned away and can only be moved through. LSD does not replace any of those things. At its best, in the hands of people who know what they're doing and care about who they're doing it with, it appears to create conditions in which those kinds of human connections become possible in a more concentrated and accessible form. The therapeutic results that are showing up in the new clinical literature are not results that come from the drug alone. They come from the drug in the presence of trained, caring humans, in a safe environment, with careful preparation before and careful integration after. The drug is the key that opens the door. The therapy is the work of going through it, and the person, the actual specific, suffering, resilient, complicated human person in the room, is the only one who can decide what to do with what they find on the other side. That seems worth saying out loud in 2026, in the middle of what is increasingly being described as a mental health crisis in much of the developed world. A crisis of depression and anxiety and PTSD and addiction, and the particular modern suffering that comes from living inside a culture that moves very fast and asks very large questions about meaning and purpose and connection without providing very many satisfying answers. The existing tools help some people some of the time. They do not help everyone. There's a large gap between what people need and what is currently available, and that gap has been present and growing for decades. Whether LSD-assisted therapy will eventually fill a meaningful part of that gap remains to be seen. The evidence so far suggests that it might. The evidence so far suggests that for certain conditions, in certain populations, in the right context, it works remarkably well. Whether the regulatory and political and social infrastructure will develop in time to make it available to the people who need it, at the scale at which they need it, without the catastrophic mismanagement that defined its first public encounter with the world, that is a question whose answer belongs to the future, which is not a country either of us can visit tonight. What we can say, lying here in the dark, is that the human mind is extraordinary. You have one. It is running right now, quieter than it was when you began listening, its default mode network perhaps slowing towards sleep, its hierarchical structures relaxing their grip on the day's concerns, the background narrator going quiet. You have not taken any LSD. You have simply been lying still and listening and letting the story of a molecule move through you in the form of words. And somewhere in the distance between the first sentence and this one, you have thought about consciousness and about death and about what it means to face something frightening without the usual defences, and about what it would mean to encounter your own mind in a new way, and about the bicycle, always the bicycle, moving through the streets of Basel on an April afternoon in 1943, carrying a man who had no idea what was happening to him and would spend the rest of his very long life trying to explain it. He never fully managed it. The explanation is not the experience, and the experience is not transferable. And this is the thing about consciousness that LSD makes undeniable. It is first person, irreducibly, always and entirely. Whatever Hofmann felt on that bicycle, whatever the cancer patients felt in the clinical trials when their fear of death shifted into something they could carry, whatever the musicians felt when the music started sounding like the inside of something instead of the outside, none of it can be fully communicated. None of it can be handed over. Each of us is sealed inside our own skull, making our own sense of a world that is larger and stranger than any of the maps we draw of it. LSD does not change that fundamental condition. It just makes it briefly, startlingly, undeniably visible. And maybe that is the most human thing about this entire story. Not the chemistry, not the politics, not the clinical trials, not the musicians or the governments or the underground chemists or the well-meaning psychiatrists who watched their research programs shut down and spent decades quietly hoping the door would open again. The most human thing is the impulse underneath all of it. The impulse that drove Hofmann back to a compound he had set aside, that drove patients into clinical trials for treatments their doctors could not offer them through conventional means, that drove the deadheads across the country following music that sounded like the inside of the experience they were already having. It is the impulse to understand what is actually happening inside this extraordinary and bewildering thing called being conscious, to know what the mind really is when it is not performing its usual duties, to find, even briefly, a version of yourself that is not defined by the accumulated weight of your particular history and your particular fears and your particular daily exhaustions, to encounter something that feels, for reasons you cannot fully articulate, more real than ordinary reality. That impulse is not pathological. It is not countercultural. It is not even particularly modern. It is as old as the Eleusinian mysteries, as old as the shamanic traditions that Wasson documented, as old as every human community that ever sat around a fire and tried to reach beyond the edge of the visible world by whatever means they had available. We have always wanted to know what is on the other side of ordinary consciousness. LSD is just the most recent, most potent, most politically complicated, and most thoroughly documented attempt to find out. The attempts will continue. They always have. There is something quietly hopeful in that, if you let yourself sit with it. Not hope of the naive variety, not the belief that a molecule will fix what is broken in the world, or that the right drug in the right hands will dissolve the accumulated suffering of a culture that has been accumulating it for centuries. That variety of hope burned itself out in 1969 and deserved to. The hope that remains is quieter and more durable. It is the hope of the researchers who kept writing, kept thinking, kept preparing their applications for the next round of funding across 30 years of prohibition, because they had seen what was possible and could not convince themselves that it did not matter. It is the hope of the clinicians sitting with their patients in carefully prepared rooms, not promising anything, just being present for whatever emerges. It is the hope embedded in the simple fact that the science came back, that the evidence accumulated, that the trials ran, that the journals published the results, that the public conversation changed, slowly, imperfectly, in the context of enormous ongoing complexity. But it changed. The problem child, it turns out, was not finished. So tonight, as you drift towards sleep in whatever quiet corner of the world you have made for yourself, with your pillow and your familiar ceiling, and the soft sounds of whatever version of outside exists beyond your walls, maybe sit for a moment with the fact of your own mind, the one that has been with you for your entire life, the one that narrates everything, filters everything, constructs the continuous story of being you. It is a remarkable instrument. It has been doing its work without a break since the first moment you opened your eyes, and it will go on doing it tomorrow in all its ordinary and extraordinary complexity without you having to ask it to. It makes you yourself. It makes the world visible to you. It is, of all the things you were born with, the strangest and most precious and least understood. Albert Hofmann understood that better than almost anyone who has ever lived. He had good reasons to. Sleep well. Dream whatever your mind decides to give you tonight. And if any of it is vivid or strange or shot through with colours that seem more real than the daylight colours, don't worry. That is just your brain, doing what it has always done, being more extraordinary than you remember to notice on an ordinary night, in the ongoing mystery of being alive and awake and then finally mercifully asleep. The bicycle has arrived home. The notebook is on the desk. The morning will come,